Hey there, welcome to part 2 of deploy a Python web application from scratch on Linode. Now in this one, it's all about setting up the fundamentals of our security. So that means we are going to create a non-root user, the necessary groups and permissions for that user, and then we're going to go ahead and add in a firewall and then spin up an NGINX installation. Now, all of these things are fundamental to build our web application and to make sure that we're doing it in as secure as a manner up front. Now, security is something that we are going to have to take seriously all the time. So what we do here is really scratching the surface of all the things we could do to ensure that our web applications are secure. But be sure that you are subscribed because we are doing multiple parts to this series, and also check the description for various time codes so you can jump around to the sections that interest you most, or so you can come back and pick up where you left off. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So now what we want to do is actually create a way for us to never actually have to write a password again. So if I actually do log out here or exit, you could type out exit as well. We now want to go back in. We want to SSH back in. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and I have to enter my password, right? So when I'm developing locally, when I'm doing all of my testing, I don't necessarily want to enter this password every time, and especially a password that looks like this or potentially even more complicated. So what we need to do is we need to actually create a SSH key that we can store on the server and on our local machine so they can communicate with each other. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and create our first SSH key, which is SSH-keygen, and then we'll use the type of RSA, so -T RSA, and then -B 4096. So once we hit enter here, it's going to go ahead and create a key for us. It's actually going to create two for us. One is a private key, one is a public key. So the public key is the one that we are going to put onto our Linode in just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and it's saying that it's generating this public-private RSA key pair. And you pretty much always save it in the default unless you already have one there, in which you can use the one you already have there, or you can create a brand new one. I typically go off of the default, or at least store it in this location. So if you were to change it, you would change it like this. Right, so again, I'm going to just use the default of ID RSA, which I could have hit enter for or just retype it out. I hit enter. Now what it's asking for is a passphrase. So this is another password that you can totally add, and for the vast majority of production projects, you totally should. Now for us, we are testing things out. I'm not going to put a passphrase, so I'll just hit enter and enter again, and there is my new public and private SSH key. So we can actually take a look at these things, and we should. So what we want to do is we want to look inside of this folder right here. And to do that, we use a command. I'm going to go ahead and type out clear here for a moment to clear out the screen so we're right up top. I'm going to use the command cd and enter in this path. Now, your path is certainly going to be different. If I scroll up a little bit, your path will definitely be different unless your username is CFE, of course. So I'm going to cd into this folder and hit enter and list everything out that's in there. Again, I'm on my local machine here, and what I see is, well, 3 different files: IDRSA, IDRSA pub, and known hosts. The one we're really interested in is the IDRSA pub, but before I do that, I can actually do cat, which is essentially like, hey, show me the contents, and known hosts, and hit enter. And this is actually my Linode server, right? And we see the IP address in here. And if for some reason I wanted to reprompt the known server, I could edit this file or just remove it and remove known hosts. This does remove that file. It's no longer there, right? So rm means remove. it's no longer there. So the next time I SSH, it's going to ask me again if I want to allow this host to come in, which is kind of cool. Next, what I'm going to do is actually use cat to see id rsa.pub, hit enter, and now I see this publish key, right? So my name is Justin, and it has my primary, computer's name on here, and then the username on here as well, and this publishable key. Now, what I just did a moment ago with creating this key, I can absolutely recreate this, and I'm going to do that because this is no longer a great key for me because it's recorded, right? Somebody could stop and copy all these things and potentially do malicious things. Probably not, because this is the public key. So there's a good chance that that also wouldn't happen as well. But if for some reason you copy this and try to get into my services, you probably would fail because of the private key. But there's probably a way to hack it, and I'm not a security expert. So what I would say is I would just go ahead and create a brand new key when it's all said and done, just to give myself peace of mind. But while we're at that, I can actually copy this entire thing and I can bring it into my production service, right? So I can actually bring it into any host that I want to. So again, I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And this time I'm going to bring it into a text file. In this case, it's VS Code. And I'm going to paste that in here. Now, there is a more efficient way to do this if you're on Mac and Linux, but Windows users, this to me is probably the most efficient, and well, you get a better idea of absolutely what's going on. Now, this key we can also use when we are provisioning Linode services. So when we went into create, I mentioned that down here you can add an SSH key. That's this right here. So I can actually paste that in here, and that would kind of circumvent us needing to use this actual same process. But of course, I'm not going to re-provision something at this point. Instead, what I want to do is just go back into, my project and, work on it from there instead of creating a new one right here. But again, you can do whatever you'd like in that case. So going back into the terminal, I'm going to go ahead and hit clear, and we're going to go ahead and SSH back into our project, and that is this Linode right here. We'll SSH just like that. And again, it's asking if we want to continue based off of the fact that I removed this from my known hosts. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. And then again, we need to use that password. So back into VS Code. I'm going to copy this, hit enter, and there we go. Okay, so now we just need to add this key in here. So there's a few different ways on how we're going to go about doing this. And in fact, we are going to do this exact same process all over again when we create a brand new user in the next part. So I'm going to go ahead and do make dir, and we'll do -p, the tilde, so that's squirrely line, /.ssh. So this is going to make the SSH directory and all of its parent directories if it needs to in the .ssh file. Or folder, rather. And that is identical to what we had on our local machine. So .ssh is the folder that you're going to want to store things at, whether it's on our, our actual host, the root, the virtual machine, or if it's on local. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make that directory, and then I'm going to go ahead and do chmod 700 tilde./ssh. So this just gives me permission to use this folder. This is just a permissions command. We're not going to get into those right now, but they are commands that might be good to learn if you want to get deeper and deeper into Linux. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and copy this. Next thing is we're going to go ahead and do something called nano tilde/.ssh/authorized _ keys. Make sure you spell this correctly. Now, Nano might not be installed on the machine that you're using. This is just going to allow me to edit this, right? So if you use Vim, if you use many other tools to actually write this, you totally can. I like Nano because I think it's pretty easy for the vast majority of people to get. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and it opens up this file here. So this file is where I'm going to want to put that key, that public key. And so notice that it's authorized keys. Also notice that it says root, right? So it's the root user. It is not a different user. We will have to do this again once we create another user. And so now I'm going to go ahead and copy this key here, and I'm going to paste this in, hit Control X to end our session, Y to save it, Enter to write it. It's a lot of things. So going back in here, and if I did make some changes, I would hit Control C, Y, save, right? So let's go ahead and just delete everything here. Y, save. So again, remove that file. We'll remove it, and we'll do that all over again, just so you know and feel good about it, hopefully. So again, copying this whole piece here, paste it in, X, Control X, Y, Enter. There we go. And again, if I do cat, like I did before, and hit enter on that, I should see just that one single line. Okay, great. So with that, I need to add permissions for this as well. So again, we will use chomod. So chomod and now 600 ~.ssh/authorized keys, hit enter. Cool. Now I just need to exit out of my session. And if I press up and enter, I should not be prompted for my password again. Now, as you might imagine, this is potentially insecure because if anyone gets a hold of my local machine and they SSH into this virtual machine, they totally can cause a lot of damage. And scrolling back up a bit, the way they would even know what machines to look into is that old known hosts thing, right? So the known host, when it actually asked me this, right? That's how they would actually know this IP address. So there's a lot of ways that people can really mess with stuff. But the only reason I'm telling you that is just to be aware of it and to be, diligent about changing things when you need to. And if I were to change my public key right now, then the actual host, our Linode, would deny me access to getting this stuff. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so now that we've got these things handled, we have a passwordless way to just go in and write commands. I actually want to create a different user with a group and certain permissions that only that user has. Because the main thing is, I actually don't want to be logging into the root user all of the time. Now, when you're learning, you can totally use a root user, and that's probably fine. But the idea with creating a new user and using that is to just get in really better practices so you don't forget, really. That's the other thing is, like down the line, you might forget to create a new user and just go off of root. This is not good practice, so it's something we want to avoid. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and create our non-root user on our Linode. So going back into the Linode console, into our specific Linode, I'm going to go ahead and copy the SSH command. Of course, you can memorize this, but I do this. I copy it and make it easy that way. And then I SSH in, and there we go. Okay, so I'm already in there. I have passwordless entry now. So now it's just time to create our user. Now, to do this, it's a few commands that are fairly simple. The first one is using sudo. So only your root user would have sudo by default. Sudo means the super user do, or the super user grants permission to do this command. So we'll do sudo user add -m and then whatever name you want to give it. In my case, I'm going to call it CFE. I'm going to hit enter, and now I have a brand new user, which is pretty cool. And then the next thing is we can do sudo password, or PSSWD CFE, and create a password specifically for this user. Notice it's not prompting me for the current password. So this is another way to just change that password as well, which is pretty cool. So now what I'm going to do is actually just use a previously stored password. This is the same password as my root user. In production, do not do this. Get a new password for every new user you bring in. But again, we're learning right now, so I want to keep things as simple as possible while also mentioning what you should be doing. Okay, So now we've got this user with that same password. Obviously, I pasted these in, and you can't see them because of security reasons. Okay, so now that I've got that, let's go ahead and exit out of here. And I actually want to go into CFE with that user. So I'm going to go ahead and SSH CFE now at 45.79.100.43, or really that IP address, which is the same IP address is what we see here on our Linode. And, I just changed the username. And going back into the terminal, I can paste in that password that I created. And what do you know? I can actually log in here. If I do pwd here, it shows me that I'm on the home user. And in this case, I actually was able to SSH in here without updating the keys, right? I didn't actually have to add the SSH keys. But I think it's a good idea to also add it to specific users, because not every Linux distribution will necessarily do this, and not every time will you want to have every SSH key on your root. Like, you might not want your root user to have an SSH key. So let's go ahead and bring it in here. First off, I'll go ahead and clear this out and do make dir again, -p, the tilde /.ssh, and then we're going to get chomod 700 of that folder, and then we'll go ahead and do nano tilde/.ssh/authorized keys, hit enter, and I'm going to go ahead and copy the SSH key that I had here, that public key, so the .pub version, and I'm going to go ahead and do Control X, Y, enter. It created those keys. We can verify that with using cat. We can see those keys in there, and we can also see that if I use the direct or the absolute path to that file by doing cat home / then .ssh keys, I see that same thing, right? So part of the reason you use tilde/ is just to say in the root of the user's folder, which is what this is doing right here. And if you remember back to when we were using the root user, we actually had root in here, not home /CFE. Okay, cool. So now we've got those keys. We just need to do chomod and 600 tilde /.ssh and authorized keys. Hit enter. And now we should definitely have those authorized keys working, so we can use SSH for either user. And now if I actually go into my root user and change those authorized keys by simply doing remove tilde.ssh/authorized keys and hit enter, exit out of here. Now when I go into CFE, I actually do use those keys. And if I go into root, it should now prompt me for that password. This, I think, is actually really good practice to get into, because you don't want just anyone going into your root, because it's really easy to just type out root on any IP address that's inside of your known hosts and perhaps cause a lot of havoc. Because the thing about this is your new user has very few permissions on the entire system. So we want to be really good about limiting the permissions that that user has, only because that user is going to be the one that actually runs our web application that anyone in the world would have access to. And again, I'm not a security expert. If you are, then you probably know several other things that we could probably do to make this even better. But since we're not security experts, we still want to take at least some security precautions, if not a lot of the low-hanging fruit ones, like what I just did. So anyways, let's go ahead and jump back into that root user with this password here and hit enter. There we go. So we're back into that root user here. I can clear this out. Now what I want to do is add a group that is going to be incredibly common for web applications. So this group is a little bit different than the username I just gave. CFE is a username that you may or may not use. But the idea here now is to use a group that we definitely all should use, which is www-data. So what we're going to do here is do sudo group add www-data and hit enter. Now, in this case, it already exists, which is good. But it's possible that it didn't already exist, right? So if it didn't already exist, go ahead and add it now. Now, of course, if you want to use a different group name, you totally can, but the challenge comes up is the permissions that this group has, which hopefully we solve some of those things in just a moment. Now, I want to stop for a second and say, hey, this might seem to be incredibly dry and incredibly drawn out of like, why do we have to do all of these steps prior to launching a web application? And it has to do with the fact that if you open up something to the world, you want to make sure that you're as secure as you possibly can be. Could we skip these steps and never have any security issues? Absolutely. I actually hope that's the case for you. But there's a really good chance that a lot of clever hackers and people that are trying to break into your system, there's a really good chance that they can get around a lot of these super easy security flaws. And it's better to, at least have some protection up front than to just assume that everything's going to be okay. So, that being said, we will keep going along these routes. And if you guys know of better security practices, let us know in the description because we all need to be vigilant about doing this. Okay, so now I added this group and we're going to go ahead and now do sudo user mod -a-G, the group name, which is www.data, and then our recently created username. And so now that user is inside of that group. We can actually see this by doing grep. Grep is a way to kind of search things. So I'm going to go ahead and do www.data, the actual group name itself. And we want to search this inside of the folder of etc/group. We hit enter and we see that CFE is in here. Right, so if you had a different group name, that group name would show up there. Cool. So the next thing is we want to add some folders that our project is likely going to use. So if we cd into the location of var, this is where you'll often see, project-specific folders. Right. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and make a directory in here for ww. We're going to make one for our Git repos. We'll talk about that later, and we'll also make a specific one for our logs. Now, the reason I'm doing it this way is really to illustrate the purpose, whereas some of these other ones you could probably use in conjunction with our project. So let's go ahead and do our directory. So first off is mkdir-p var ww. Now, this command can be ran anywhere on your machine. It doesn't have to be inside of the var command. And if I press up and do -logs, I'm creating that folder as well, and then -up again for Git. Now, again, these are just temporary folders. The really only one that you would end up using in the long run, most likely, is ww, but I just wanted to make it really simple and obvious that anything with ww in it is something that we added to this specific folder. That's really the key thing here. So now what we want to do is give the correct permissions to these folders to our user group. Now, over time, we might have to update permissions or we might have to change certain things, and that will likely happen. But the idea here is I want to just give some of the baseline permissions to this area. And we'll go ahead and do sudo, and this is chgrp-r. So we are basically just changing the ownership for the group here, which is www.data. Again, the group that I almost added, or well, in this case, I'm just using, which is what already exists. And then we're going to go ahead and do each folder again. Now, this exact same command can be ran anywhere on there as long as you have root access. We'll hit enter and then do -logs and -git as well. And now that ownership has changed. So if we list out everything, what we should see here is the vast majority of them say root or maybe another group that we don't have to worry about right now. But the ones that we did just create with our user now have a different owner in there, which is www.data. So the next thing is we just need to give permissions to that group for executing, reading, and writing things. So to do that, we do sudo chmod-r again. And now we're just going to use the command of g+rwxs This right here is giving us read, write, and execute, as well as a few other permissions in here for the actual place that we want to do, which is var www. Now notice that I didn't actually have to declare the group. That's part of what's going on with these commands right here, and the fact that the group is already the owner. Okay, so we add that one, www, and then logs. The trailing slash is not necessary, and then git. Okay, cool. So that changes the ownership, that changes all the permissions that we need. So the last thing I need to do is really just reboot this machine. Now the reason I rebooted it is because I need to make sure that my new user and their group and their permissions all take hold, and we want to do that as early as possible. So now that we have this, what we are going to move into is actually installing some of the dependencies our project needs to actually run. So from here on out, hopefully we've actually set up everything necessary that you will need for your user, the group, the SSH. So from here on out, it should be just really configuring and getting ready for our actual project. In this one, we're going to be installing NGINX and a firewall called UFW, and that stands for Uncomplicated Firewall. Now, the idea of using both of these things is so we can securely display our web sites and web applications. Initially, it's just going to be a static website, but over time, we will turn it into a web application. And we also want to allow SSH to continue to work. So the idea of a firewall is to block all ports by default unless we enable them. So we want to enable the access of SSH. So that's a specific port, or we can actually use UFW to make it really easy for SSH to continue to work. Of course, if we skip the SSH part, then we won't have access into our actual Linode, which is something we definitely don't want to do. Next, we're going to go ahead and install and use NGINX to actually allow a web server to work, to actually expose port 80 and 443. Those are the common ports for both secure and unsecure websites. Initially, we are going to start with just unsecure just to get it working, because adding certificates for secure websites adds a whole layer of complexity that we're just not going to do yet. And if you want to see that, just let me know in the comments and we can do that in the future. Okay, so it's really simple. So first off, we're going to go ahead and jump in to our SSH session. And earlier we set up where our root still needed a password, where a different user did not. In this case, I still want to log in as my root user because I'm making some major configurations here. So I still have that password available for me, and I'm going to go ahead and log in there. Okay, so typically when you are installing new software, what you want to do is sudo apt get update. Sometimes you'll see it as just sudo apt update. apt-get is the long-term supported version of that. And so what this is going to do is just update everything on your local system to make sure that you can actually install NGINX and UFW. In some cases, if you didn't update it, you might not be able to install NGINX and UFW. So let's go ahead and do sudo apt-get install, and we'll start off with UFW, and we'll also install NGINX. So if you're familiar with something called Apache, you can absolutely use Apache instead. I just prefer NGINX for web servers. I think the configuration and the robustness of NGINX is quite a bit better than Apache has been in the past. But of course that can change. But the general idea here is we are installing a firewall and NGINX, and then I'll just go ahead and say yes to just accept the additional size that requirements that it takes on your system. So that -y is what did that. So this shouldn't actually take that long because neither package is actually that big. And of course, when I say package, I mean application is that big. And so, yeah, it just might take a moment or two for it to fully finish. All right, so it took about maybe 2 minutes to actually finish this. But now that we actually have NGINX installed, what we should be able to do is actually go into our IP address. So let's go ahead and copy our IP address and go to it directly. And we see that NGINX is installed and working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the firewall now to disable this. and it'll just be disabled by default, and then we'll come back to re-enable it. So back into our system here, the idea is to first off allow our SSH, because we don't want to end our SSH sessions. Now there might be a time that you want to disallow SSH, but I'm not going to do that right now. We're going to keep things pretty high level and pretty simple. So sudo UFW allow SSH, and that allows and updates my rules. And then I'll do sudo UFW and enable and hit enter. And again, this may disrupt existing SSH connections. In this case, it should not, because we just allowed it. If you failed here, if that is a problem, you actually might have to just start all over with a brand new Linode, add a new user, permissions, all of those things. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and say yes. And I wasn't booted, so it is successful, and I can verify that with sudo UFW and status and hit enter. And now it's showing me the only 2 ports that are actually allowed on this system. So if I actually go back to that, port here, or the IP address here, which is actually coming and by default going to port 80, it should actually time out, right? So it looks like it's still available, but it's actually loading. So if I actually copy that and close it out and then try to do it again, it's going to time out because it's no longer enabled. Now, this is what's cool about a firewall, is you can just turn these things on and off at any time, and sometimes it makes sense to do so. So in this case, what I'm going to do now is just sudo UFW and allow NGINX full. And actually, we want to type it out as NGINX and full, just like that. We hit enter, new rules are added, and we look at the status. Now it's giving me NGINX full. So this gives me permissions to port 80 and port 443. So those are the standard ports for web applications. And of course, the timeout went away because, well, I allowed NGINX to work, and Chrome often will reconnect if it is timing out. A lot of modern browsers will do that. But there we go. So we now actually have a firewall and NGINX working. So one of the other benefits of this, or downsides, depending on how you look at it, is the fact that if I had, let's say, a Postgres database and I wanted to use this particular server as a Postgres database server, outside world would not have access to it. Like nowhere would have access to it because of the port firewall that is actually preventing access to any given port that is not listed right here. And of course, we could change that with allow, doing UF allow, and then whatever we wanted to use. So 6543, you can allow that then, and you would see the status of what that is, right? So that's actually pretty nice. I think using a firewall like this just adds another layer of security and just another way to ensure our backend is safe, or as safe as we can make it. Now, of course, again, I'm not a security expert, so there's probably still ways that you can get around a lot of these security features. But the general rule of thumb, this is a low-hanging fruit to just grab it and add it. Now, since I did add this port of 6543, I actually want to get rid of that. So we just do it with sudo UFW delete allow of the 6543, and that should actually remove that rule for me. And I see in there now it's gone. So that's pretty cool. That's a really, really nice and easy way to set up a firewall. Granted, there are more conditions that we could add here, and there are more safety precautions we might want to have. But overall, we now have exactly where we want to be as far as our web server is concerned. But the thing is, I'm not quite done with NGINX. What I want to be able to do is I want to actually edit NGINX. So what I want to do now is I want to exit out of my root user, and this time I'm going to go in as my other user, that original user that we created, or the secondary user. Now this user doesn't have very many permissions, right? We had this user to be pretty permissionless by default, with the exception of CD var and www. So if we list out in here, this HTML here is actually the same HTML file that's driving this NGINX page. So what we can do is use nano, not sudo, but just nano index.nginx debian .html, hit enter, and notice that right off the bat, it says it's unwritable. So I actually don't have permissions to make changes to this. This is because we added NGINX after updating our permissions for this particular folder. So what we want to do now is change those permissions. Now, if we were going to stick with a static file, this is what we would do, as in a static file-based website. Like if I wanted to use just HTML pages, I would need to change the permissions for this particular folder, right? And I need to do that with the root user. Now I'm actually going to log back out and go in as the root user and make those changes. So I'll press up a couple times and there's my root user. I just need to grab the password, paste that in here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cd into var www, and we want to change this HTML folder to the permissions correctly. So it's again sudo chgrp and then -R www data, because again that CFE user is inside of that group, and then it'll be var www html. Now you don't have to do the absolute path, you could just write out HTML. In cases like this, I like doing the absolute path. Okay, so now if we list it out, we should see that www data is now associated to that HTML folder. And then now I'm going to go ahead and do sudo chmod -R again, this time g plus rwxs, and then var www html, enter. Now again, we'll go ahead and exit out of here. This time I'm going to clear it out and SSH in as my CFE user. And now let's go ahead and do cd var www html. And now I can actually make some changes here and say nano in there. And notice that that error is gone. And I can actually say this and say, instead of welcome to NGINX, I'm using my arrow keys here to actually come in there. So we'll say, hello world, this is a Linode. And then use Control X to exit, Y to save the changes, Enter to save to that specific file name. And then if we look into our port on anywhere in the world, as long as this Linode is running, I can refresh in here, and what do you know? So at this point right here, if we weren't wanting a web application, we could use this as a standard static site. And I could actually just put it into var www html. Now you're probably well aware that there's a lot of challenges in just changing the contents of this file, and especially doing it using Nano. So we certainly need to improve where that is, and that's what we'll do in the next part. We'll actually introduce this concept of Git, but using everything that we've done so far. That is SSH, using our actual SSH keys, using the firewall as it stands right now, and then allowing for Git to actually handle the version changes that do change over time, so we can at least change this HTML, if not more than that. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. And if you did, be sure to do a thumbs up and share this with a friend of yours that might get something out of it. Now, of course, if you do have questions or you want to let us know about something else, please write it down in the comments below so myself or the Linode support team can actually help you diagnose some of these issues. Once again, I'm Justin, and I look forward to seeing you next time.